The studio lights bathed everything in that familiar golden glow, casting the kind of warmth that made even the most uncomfortable conversations feel civilized. Tonight's episode of the Piers Morgan Show promised to be a standard celebrity interview, so the audience believed as they settled into their seats, programs rustling in their hands. Chris Evans strode onto the set with that effortless charm that had made him America's sweetheart. His navy blazer fit perfectly, his smile genuine as he waved to the audience. The applause was thunderous, filled with the kind of affection usually reserved for beloved family members. He looked relaxed, confident, ready to discuss his latest project without a care in the world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you, ladies and gentlemen. Chris Evans, Piers Morgan announced, rising from his chair with his trademark polished smile. The handshake between them was firm, cordial, the kind of greeting between two professionals who respected each other's place in the entertainment ecosystem. Great to be here, Piers, Chris said, settling into the guest chair and adjusting his jacket, though I have to say, your weather here is still giving me trouble. 3 layers this morning, and I was still freezing. The audience chuckled appreciatively. Piers leaned back, his notes resting casually on his knee. Well, you're in good company. Half of Britain spends winter wondering why we don't just move somewhere warmer. His tone was light, conversational, but let's talk about something that should warm you up, this new political drama you're starring in. The Senator's Gambit. Tell us about it. Chris's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. It's a project I've been passionate about for years, actually. The story follows a senator who has to choose between party loyalty and doing what's right for his constituents. It's timely, I think, given everything happening in politics right now, and working with Helena Bonham Carter, again, that must have been exciting. Incredible. Chris nodded. Helena brings this intensity to every scene that just elevates everyone around her. There's one scene where he paused, grinning. Well, I can't spoil it, but let's just say she reminded me why she's one of the best actors of our generation. In the control room, Tom's voice crackled through Piers' earpiece. Nice chemistry. But we need to move toward the good stuff soon. We've got them hooked now. Let's give them what they came for. Piers nodded almost imperceptibly, his smile never wavering. On the floor, Sophie Trent moved quietly between cameras, ensuring the audience remained engaged. She caught Chris's eye briefly, giving him an encouraging nod. Everything felt normal, professional, safe. But beneath the surface pleasantries, Piers was already calculating his next move. His questions about the film were genuine enough, but they were also stepping stones to something deeper, more provocative. The real interview was about to begin. You know, Piers began, his tone shifting subtly from casual to contemplative. This film deals with political integrity, which is interesting timing given your own, shall we say, very vocal presence in the political arena. The temperature in the room didn't drop exactly, but something changed. Chris's smile remained, but his posture straightened slightly. I think it's important for citizens to engage with the political process, regardless of their profession. Indeed, Piers flipped through his notes with deliberate care, and you've certainly been engaged. Your Twitter account has become quite the political platform. Just last month, you called Senator Richardson's immigration bill morally bankrupt. Strong words from Captain America himself. A few audience members shifted in their seats. Chris's expression grew more serious, though he maintained his composure. I believe in speaking truth to power. Piers, when I see policies that I believe will harm vulnerable people, I think it's my responsibility as a citizen to speak up. Your responsibility, Piers repeated, as if tasting the words. But some might argue that your responsibility as an entertainer is too well entertained. To bring people together rather than divide them along political lines. Chris leaned forward, slightly, his voice taking on a deeper, more passionate tone. I think bringing people together means speaking honestly about the issues that affect us all. Silence in the face of injustice isn't unity, it's complicity. Tom's voice buzzed in Piers's ear. Good, he's engaging. Push a little harder. Piers nodded thoughtfully. That's a noble sentiment. But tell me, do you ever worry that your political commentary might alienate the very people who look up to you? The families who take their children to see Captain America, only to find out the man behind the shield has very strong and, some might say, divisive political opinions. The question hung in the air like smoke. Chris was quiet for a moment, his jaw working slightly as he considered his response. When he spoke, his voice was measured but firm. I think parents want their children to look up to people who stand For something, Piers, if teaching kids that it's important to speak up for what's right alienates some people, then maybe that says more about those people than it does about me. A ripple of applause scattered through the audience, but it wasn't universal. Sophie noticed a few audience members exchange glances, their expressions uncertain. The evening was beginning to find its edge. Piers set his notes aside and leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. Let's dig into that a bit, shall we? Recent polling suggests that when celebrities wade into political waters, it can actually hurt their careers. Are you prepared for that possibility? Chris's smile tightened just a fraction. I'm prepared to live with the consequences of standing up for what I believe in, yes. Even if it means losing fans. Even if it means studios think twice before casting you because you've become too controversial. You know what's controversial, Piers? Chris's voice carried a new edge. Staying silent while people suffer? Dr. King was controversial. Eleanor Roosevelt was controversial. Sometimes being on the right side of history means being uncomfortable in the present. The audience stirred, some nodding approvingly, while others seemed taken aback by the historical comparisons. Piers raised an eyebrow, his interviewer instincts sharpening. That's quite a comparison. But Dr. King and Eleanor Roosevelt were political figures, activists by choice and necessity. You're an actor who happened to become famous playing a superhero. Do you really think those situations are equivalent? Chris's composure slipped just slightly, his eyes flashing. I think anyone with a platform has a responsibility to use it for good. Fame doesn't disqualify you from having a conscience, but it does complicate things, doesn't it? Piers pressed. When you speak, millions listen. When you tweet, it trends. Worldwide. That kind of influence comes with enormous responsibility. How do you know you're always getting it right? I don't, Chris admitted, but his voice grew stronger. But I'd rather make mistakes while trying to help people than stay quiet and let injustice go unchallenged. Tom's voice crackled through Piers's earpiece. He's getting defensive. This is good television. Keep pushing. Sophie watched from the wings, noting how Chris's posture had changed. His shoulders were squarer now, his hands gesturing more emphatically. The easy charm was giving way to something more raw, more authentic and, potentially more volatile. Piers smiled, but there was something predatory in it now. Noble words, Chris, but let's test that conviction a bit, shall we? Let me ask you something more personal, Piers said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register that somehow felt more dangerous than his louder tones. Your activism, and let's call it what it is, seems to have ramped up significantly in recent years. Some observers have suggested it's less about genuine conviction and more about image management, a way to appear serious, thoughtful, relevant, in an industry that often discards aging action stars. The studio fell silent. Even the usual shuffling and coughing from the audience stopped. Chris stared at Piers for a long moment, his expression unreadable. That's quite an accusation, Chris said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. Is it an accusation, or is it a question? Piers replied smoothly. I'm simply asking whether your sudden political awakening coincides a bit too neatly with Hollywood's current appetite for socially conscious celebrities. Chris leaned back in his chair, but it wasn't a relaxed movement. It was the kind of positioning a boxer might make before throwing a punch. My convictions aren't sudden, Piers. I've been involved in social causes since long before it was fashionable. The difference is that now I have a platform large enough for people like you to notice. People like me. Journalists looking for a story. Interviewers who mistake cynicism for insight. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some gasps, some nervous laughter. Sophie caught the eye of one of the camera operators, signaling him to get a wide shot of the audience reaction. Tom's voice in Piers's ear was excited now. Perfect. He's getting hot. Keep going. Piers maintained his composure, but his smile had an edge to it. So you're saying your political engagement has nothing to do with staying relevant in an industry that values activism? I'm saying that reducing genuine concern for people's well-being to a career strategy says more about your worldview than mine. Chris shot back. Not everything is calculated, Piers. Some of us actually give a damn about something other than ratings. The jab landed. Piers's smile faltered for just a moment before returning, but now it looked forced. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted completely. What had started as a polite interview had become something else entirely, a duel between two very different philosophies. Two very different approaches to public life. Well, Piers said, recovering his composure, you certainly don't lack for passion. But passion without wisdom can be dangerous, don't you think? Chris's eyes narrowed. Are you questioning my wisdom, or my right to have opinions? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone in the studio knew they were no longer watching an interview. They were watching a confrontation. Piers shuffled through his notes with theatrical deliberation, letting the tension build before delivering his next strike. Let's talk about consistency, shall we? In 2019, you tweeted that we should listen to science and facts, not fear and politics regarding climate change. Yet just 6 months later, you endorsed a political candidate whose environmental record was, let's say, questionable at best. How do you reconcile that contradiction? Chris's jaw tightened visibly. That's not a contradiction, it's a recognition that sometimes you have to choose between imperfect options to prevent worse outcomes. Convenient, Piers replied smoothly. And what about your passionate defense of privacy rights, contrasted with your very public criticism of people who choose to remain private about their political beliefs? Seems a bit hypocritical, doesn't it? You're taking things out of context, Chris said, his voice rising slightly. Defending someone's right to privacy doesn't mean defending their right to remain silent about injustice. Context, Piers repeated, savoring the word. The last refuge of the caught-out celebrity. Tell me, Chris, is there any criticism of your political stance that you would accept as valid, or is it all just taken out of context? Chris stood up abruptly, then caught himself and sat back down, but the movement had been captured by every camera in the room. The audience collectively held its breath. You know what, Piers? Chris's voice was controlled, but barely. If you wanted to have a real conversation about these issues, you would have approached them differently. This isn't journalism, it's performance art. You're not interested in my answers. You're interested in making me look bad for your viewers' entertainment. I'm interested in accountability, Piers shot back. You put yourself in the public arena. You made yourself a political figure. Don't cry foul when someone asks you to defend your positions. Defend my positions, Chris laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're not asking me to defend anything. You're cherry-picking quotes and presenting them without context to create contradictions that don't exist. If you wanted a soundbite, you should have just emailed me. The audience erupted in scattered applause. Some cheering Chris's pushed back while others seemed shocked by the deteriorating civility. Sophie moved closer to the stage, her experience telling her this was heading toward uncharted territory. Tom's voice crackled urgently in Piers's earpiece. This is gold. Don't let him regain control. Push harder. Piers leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. So you admit you're only here for soundbites? That your entire public persona is carefully managed messaging? I admit that I was naive to think I could have an honest conversation with someone who's built a career on manufacturing controversy, Chris replied, his composure finally beginning to crack. You're not interested in truth, you're interested in theater? The studio felt electric now, charged with the kind of tension that makes skin prickle and hearts race. Piers sensed he had Chris exactly where he wanted him, off balance. Defensive, potentially explosive. Let's talk about theater then, Piers said, his voice deceptively calm. Your entire career is built on playing heroes, isn't it? Clean-cut, morally righteous characters who always do the right thing? Tell me, how much of your political activism is genuine conviction, and how much is just you playing Captain America in real life? Chris's hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. That's insulting. Is it, or is it perceptive? You've made millions playing America's moral compass. Now you're trying to be America's moral compass. Some might say you've confused your real identity with your fictional one, and some might say you've confused being a journalist with being a professional asshole, Chris snapped. The audience gasped audibly. Sophie took a step closer to the stage, ready to intervene if necessary. Tom's voice was practically vibrating with excitement in Piers's earpiece. Perfect. Keep him going. But Piers had miscalculated. Instead of breaking down, Chris was channeling his anger into something sharper, more focused. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You want to know the difference between playing a hero and being one, Piers? Heroes don't hide behind fake smiles while they tear people down for entertainment. Heroes don't mistake cruelty for courage. Heroes also don't lose their temper on live television, Piers replied, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. No, they don't, Chris agreed, standing up slowly. They know when to walk away from a fight that's beneath them. The movement was deliberate, controlled, but unmistakably final. Chris reached for his microphone pack, and Sophie stepped forward instinctively. Mr. Evans, she said quietly, we still have 12 minutes left in the segment. Chris looked at her with something like sympathy. I'm sorry, Sophie, this isn't your fault. but I won't sit here and be used as bait for this man's ratings trap. The audience was frozen, some half risen from their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing television history or television disaster. Piers remained seated, but his composure was finally showing cracks. "If you walk out now," Piers called, "after him, you'll only prove my point about celebrities who can't handle real scrutiny." Chris paused at the edge of the stage and turned back, his expression sad rather than angry. "No, Piers. Walking out proves that some conversations aren't worth having. Not every platform deserves your presence, and not every question deserves an answer." But Chris didn't leave, not yet. Something in Piers's expression, a flash of panic perhaps, or wounded pride, made him turn back toward the chair. The audience, sensing the shift, fell completely silent. "Actually," Chris said, his voice carrying a new kind of authority, "let me ask you something, Piers. When did you decide that destroying people was more important than understanding them? When did journalism become a blood sport for you?" Piers's mask slipped entirely now. "I'm not destroying anyone. I'm asking tough questions that need to be asked." "To whom?" Chris demanded, stepping back toward the chair but not sitting. "Who needs to know whether my political beliefs are genuine or calculated? Who benefits from you trying to tear down someone who's trying to use their platform for good? Your audience or your ego?" The question hit its mark. Piers straightened in his chair, his interviewer persona reasserting itself. "My job is to hold public figures accountable. Your job," Chris interrupted, "is supposed to be informing the public. But what you're doing here isn't journalism. It's gladiatorial combat, and you're trying to feed me to the lions for entertainment." Tom's voice in Piers's earpiece was urgent now. "Don't let him turn this around. Hit back hard." Piers took the cue, leaning forward with renewed aggression. "You know what I think, Chris? I think you came here expecting softball questions and hero worship, and now that you're facing real scrutiny, you can't handle it. Maybe that says something about how genuine your convictions really are." It was the wrong move. Chris's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, kind of settling, as if he'd finally made a decision he'd been wrestling with. "You're right about one thing," Chris said quietly. "I did come here with expectations. I expected to meet a professional. I expected to have a conversation with someone who understood the difference between tough questions and cheap shots. I expected better." He began removing his microphone with deliberate care, his movements precise and final. "But you know what the real tragedy is, Piers? You're actually a talented interviewer when you want to be, but you've chosen to be something else instead. You've chosen to be the person who mistakes cruelty for courage, who thinks tearing people down is the same as building something up." Sophie moved closer, her training kicking in, but she made no move to stop him. She'd seen enough interviews go wrong to know when someone had reached their limit. "And that," Chris continued, placing the microphone carefully on the chair, "is something I won't be part of." The silence that followed was deafening. Chris Evans, America's golden boy, the man who had embodied hope and heroism for a generation, stood on the stage of one of Britain's most watched talk shows, and made a choice that would define him far more than any role he'd ever played. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the audience directly, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the studio, "I came here tonight to talk about a film that explores the cost of standing up for what's right. It seems I've ended up living that theme instead." He walked toward the edge of the stage, then paused and turned back to face Piers, who sat frozen in his chair, apparently uncertain whether to attempt damage control or let the moment play out. "I want to be clear about something," Chris continued, his voice steady and clear. "This isn't about being unable to handle criticism. I've been criticized before, and I'll be criticized again. This is about refusing to participate in a system that treats human dignity as entertainment currency." A few audience members began to applaud, tentatively at first, then with growing conviction. Others sat in stunned silence, unsure how to process what they were witnessing. When we normalize cruelty in the name of entertainment, when we celebrate hosts who ambush guests for ratings, when we reward behavior that would be unacceptable anywhere else in civilized society, we're not building anything worthwhile. We're just feeding the machine that turns human beings into content. Sophie stepped forward then, not to stop him but to escort him safely off the stage. Her expression was professional, but there was something like respect in her eyes. "Mr. Evans," she said quietly, "I'll show you out." Chris nodded gratefully, then looked one last time at Piers, who seemed to have aged years in the span of minutes. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Piers," Chris said, and there was genuine sadness in his voice. "But I won't help you find it by sacrificing my self-respect." And with that, Chris Evans walked off the stage of the Piers Morgan Show, leaving behind a stunned audience, a shell-shocked host, and what would become one of the most discussed moments in television history. Behind him, Piers sat alone under the bright lights, the full weight of the moment settling on his shoulders as he realized he would have to somehow salvage the remaining 8 minutes of live television. Piers Morgan had been in television long enough to know that sometimes the best thing to do when you're drowning is to stop thrashing and float. He sat for a moment longer than was comfortable, letting the weight of Chris Evans's exit settle over the studio like dust after an explosion. Then, with the practiced ease of a veteran broadcaster, he turned to face the camera directly. "Well," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. That was certainly unexpected. He paused, gathering himself. "Chris Evans has just walked off this program, and I think it's important to address what just happened here." The audience was completely silent now, their attention riveted on this man who had just lost control of his own show. Sophie signaled the camera operators to focus tightly on Piers, cutting away from the empty guest chair that seemed to loom accusingly beside him. "I've been doing this job for a long time," Piers continued, his confidence returning with each word. "I've interviewed prime ministers and presidents, Nobel laureates, and ordinary people with extraordinary stories. Our job in journalism's to ask the questions that need to be asked, even when they're uncomfortable." Tom's voice in his earpiece was frantic. "Good. Keep going. Frame this as his failure, not yours." Mr. Evans came on this program to promote his film, but he also came as someone who has made himself a very public political figure. When you step into the political arena, when you use your platform to influence public opinion on matters of policy and governance, you open yourself to scrutiny. That's not cruelty, that's democracy. A few audience members nodded, though their expressions remained uncertain. Piers was regaining his footing, finding his narrative. I asked him tough questions about his political statements, about potential contradictions in his positions, about the responsibility that comes with having millions of followers hang on your every word. These are questions that any political figure would face, should face. He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a more intimate tone. "What we witnessed tonight, I believe, was someone who has become so accustomed to adulation, so too being treated as above criticism because of his celebrity status, that he couldn't handle being held accountable for his own words and actions." The camera caught a few audience members exchanging glances, some nodding more definitively now. "I don't take pleasure in what happened here tonight," Piers continued, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But I do think it reveals something important about the state of public discourse in our time. We live in an age where celebrities expect to be able to influence political conversation without facing the same scrutiny we would apply to any other public figure." Tom's voice crackled again. "Perfect. Wrap it up strong. I respect Chris Evans as an actor and as someone who clearly cares about issues he believes in. But respect doesn't mean exemption from accountability. If you want to play in the political arena, you have to be prepared for political rules." Piers looked directly into the camera, his expression serious but not unkind. "We'll be right back after this break with more of tonight's show. Thank you for staying with us through this unusual evening." As the show cut to commercial, Piers slumped slightly in his chair, the adrenaline finally beginning to fade. He had salvaged the moment, spun the narrative in his favor, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed irrevocably in those final minutes before Evans walked out. Within 20 minutes of the show's end, #EvansWalksOut was trending worldwide. Within an hour, #Piers Pushes Too Far had joined it. The internet had done what the internet does best. It had taken a complex moment and turned it into a binary war. Chris Evans sat in his hotel room, phone buzzing with calls from his publicist, his manager, his friends, and reporters seeking comment. He ignored them all, instead scrolling through the reactions flooding social media. Chris Evans just showed more integrity in 5 minutes than most politicians show in their entire careers. #EvansWalksOut, #RespectYourself. Am I the only one who thinks Piers Morgan was just doing his job? Since when is asking tough questions of public figures considered harassment? #Journalism is not dead. That wasn't journalism, that was a hit job. Piers Morgan turned an interview into a bullying session. Good for Chris Evans for refusing to play along. #EvansWalksOut. If you can't handle hard questions, don't make yourself a political figure. Evans came across as thin-skinned and entitled. #Piers Pushes Too Far was actually #Piers. Doing his job, the responses were as divided as the country itself. Each side seeing in the confrontation a reflection of their own beliefs about celebrity, politics, accountability, and respect. Meanwhile, In his own office, Piers Morgan was fielding calls from network executives, some praising the riveting television he'd created, others concerned about the potential backlash. The show's ratings had spiked dramatically in the final segments, but the long-term implications remained unclear. Piers, his producer Tom said, sticking his head into the office, BBC wants a statement, so does CNN, and someone from The Guardian is asking for a quote about the ethics of ambush journalism. Piers looked up from his computer, where he'd been reading the same social media reactions as Chris. Tell them I stand by every question I ask tonight. If Chris Evans wants to influence political discourse, he needs to be prepared for political scrutiny. But even as he said it, Piers found himself thinking about Chris's final words. I hope you find what you're looking for, Piers. What was he looking for? Ratings? Relevance? The thrill of bringing down someone the public loved? Or was there something deeper, something more complicated about his need to expose what he saw as hypocrisy and pretension in public figures? 3 days later, Chris Evans released a statement that was shared across every major platform. I don't regret walking away from that interview. I regret that we live in a media environment where walking away from toxic behavior feels like news. We've normalized cruelty in the name of accountability, and we've forgotten the difference between asking tough questions and asking them with respect for human dignity. I'll continue to speak out about issues I care about, and I'll continue to face criticism for it, but I won't participate in systems designed to turn that criticism into entertainment spectacle. Piers Morgan never directly responded to the statement, but his show's ratings remained strong, and he continued to book high-profile guests willing to sit in the chair across from him. In the end, perhaps both men got what they were looking for. Chris Evans reinforced his image as someone who wouldn't compromise his principles for public approval. Piers Morgan reinforced his reputation as the interviewer who asked the questions others wouldn't dare ask. But in the broader conversation about celebrity, politics, media, and accountability, the confrontation raised more questions than it answered. In an age of viral moments and instant judgment, does anyone really win these confrontations, or do they simply feed a spectacle that serves no one but the algorithms that spread them? The answer, like most truths in our complex media landscape, depends entirely on who you ask and what they were looking for in the first place. If you liked the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.